You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we've got a surprise rebuke against the Trump administration from a judge that Donald Trump himself appointed. Can you explain what just happened in court?
Brian, a surprise rebuke and a huge ruling because for the first time, a federal judge has ruled that Donald Trump cannot invoke the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelans or anybody else because he doesn't have the lawful basis to do it. You know, all of the litigation that we have been following, we've been tracking day in and day out, involved whether Venezuelan immigrants and others who are being deported by the Trump administration have gotten their due process rights of notice and opportunity to be heard before they're stuffed on planes and sent to an El Salvadoran prison. But no judge had yet reached the question of whether Donald Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act to try to deport human beings was lawful. And a judge, as you mentioned, a Trump-appointed judge, Judge Fernando Rodriguez out in Texas, ruled that the Trump administration is acting unlawfully because the Alien Enemies Act does not permit them to deport people. Notably, the Alien Enemies Act, which we haven't really, drilled down on the exact terms of that law, which was passed in 1798 and has only been invoked 3 times, including during World War I and World War II. That law, that old federal law, only permits aliens to be deported during a time of an organized armed attack on the United States. And Brian, I don't think there's anybody with a lick of sense or anybody who pays attention to actual facts would be able to conclude, oh, that's right, we are involved in an armed, organized attack by the nation of Venezuela. I mean, it's absurd on its face, but the challenge is all of the court cases, Abrego Garcia and so many others, have been sort of, dealing with the emergency question of whether these people got their constitutional due process rights before they were deported under the Alien Enemies Act. It took some time for the federal courts to actually get to the legal issue of whether Donald Trump has the lawful authority to do any of this in the first instance. And I'm going to say it one more time, a Trump-appointed judge just ruled Trump does not have the lawful authority. And I'm going to be waiting to see if Pam Bondi now calls this Trump-appointed judge deranged and if Donald Trump calls him a radical left-wing lunatic judge.
Okay, I have to ask this as a quick question. Is this a federal district court judge?
This is a federal district court judge out in Texas, appointed to the bench by Donald Trump.
Okay, so clearly, because it's a federal district court judge, a trial court, this doesn't establish precedent. But what impact does it have on the other cases where the same issue is at play, where Donald Trump is trying to deport these people without due process using the Alien Enemies Act? This idea that there's some massive invasion that the U.S. is contending with, and so that's the basis for him to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's exactly the right question, Brian. As you point out, it's not, legally speaking, precedent, because precedent is only set by the appellate courts when the case makes its way through the trial court, goes up to the appeals court, and the appeals court issues a ruling that then sets precedents for other trial courts in that appeals court's jurisdiction that they must follow. However, when a trial court judge makes a ruling that the executive branch of the United States government has acted unconstitutionally because they don't have the authority under the Alien Enemies Act to deport people the way they have been deporting people, all of the other federal court judges will look at it and find it to be what we call persuasive authority, not binding authority, not actual precedent, but it sets what I call an atmospheric precedence that I can all but promise you other judges will follow.
Glenn, what kind of an impact do you think that this is going to have, at least politically speaking, given the fact that, to what you alluded to before, this is a judge who Trump himself appointed. And so, whereas his go-to in this instance would just be to say, look, this is another radical, communist, Marxist, leftist Democrat, in actuality, this is someone who he himself put on the bench.
It is somebody he put on the bench. And before I answer that question, what impact will it likely have on the Trump administration? Let me just read a sentence or two from Judge Rodriguez, this Trump-appointed judge, because here is what he concluded the Trump administration is doing. He said the proclamation, in other words, Donald Trump proclaiming that, the Alien Enemies Act applies to Venezuelan gang members, and he's going to start deporting them. Donald Trump's proclamation exceeds the scope of the statute, the Alien Enemies Act, and as a result, his proclamation is unlawful. And the Trump administration officials do not possess the lawful authority under the Alien Enemies Act and based on the proclamation to detain Venezuelan aliens, to transfer them within the United States, or to remove them from the country, to deport them. This is a broad, sweeping ruling by this Trump-appointed judge. You asked the question, what kind of impact will it have on the Trump administration? First and foremost, if they give one whit about the rule of law and the Constitution, they will stop not only deporting Venezuelans, but detaining them or moving them from facility to facility inside the United States, because that's what Judge Rodriguez said is unconstitutional and unlawful. Will the Trump administration continue to do it anyway? I don't know. Is fire hot and water wet? My guess is they will continue to do it because Donald Trump has, been determined to grab all the power and wield dictatorial power. So I suspect he will keep doing it. What are the implications? And we could talk about what the Supreme Court may or may not do in the future. But one of the implications, Brian, and this is a really important one for us to keep our eyes on, now that a federal judge has ruled that any further arrests, any further transfers within the United States, and any further deportations of Venezuelan immigrants is unlawful and unconstitutional. If Trump administration officials continue to do it, guess what? They will be acting beyond the scope of their official duties as government employees and officials, and they will be subject potentially to being sued personally. They could lose everything. So I would say every ICE agent, every Trump administration official, every government employee, including those at DOJ, who are flirting with the idea of continuing to act unlawfully and unconstitutionally in the wake of this federal judge's opinion, you are risking it all. And why in the hell would you risk it all for Donald Trump?
Well, I want to delineate between two things, because there was one thing you said that I don't think Trump is going to have any bearing on, and that is the prospect of these attorneys, for example, in court losing their law licenses. But the other is that, if they have criminal exposure, isn't it true that Trump can just wield pardons to protect them? And the Supreme Court already ruled that the pardon power is plenary, and so there's really no limit to what Trump is able to do with it. So does that sound right in terms of the two ways in which the things diverge here, where we have, Donald Trump can protect them as it relates to criminal exposure, but he can't do anything to protect them in terms of losing their law licenses?
Yeah, a couple of things to unpack there. First of all, what I was talking about a moment ago was civil exposure, because when a government official acts beyond the scope of his or her official government duties, they can be sued in their personal capacity, and they could lose it all. But that's a civil matter. That's different than a criminal matter. And pardons have absolutely no impact. They cannot be used to wipe away a civil lawsuit or a judgment that is entered against a government employee. So we don't have to worry so much about presidential pardons in the context of civil lawsuits like that. However, you're right. If there is criminal exposure in any way, let's assume, thought experiment, Donald Trump orders somebody to do something that is blatantly unconstitutional. And he says, don't worry, because if you do it and you get caught and you get prosecuted, I will pardon you. I believe, Brian, it remains an open question as to whether the Supreme Court would allow the presidential pardon power, which is broad, it is sweeping, it's almost a plenary, untouchable power. But I actually believe if Donald Trump directs people to do things that are absolutely unconstitutional, the Supreme Court is very likely to carve out an exception and say that is one thing that we, as a nation, given our constitutional construct of government, cannot tolerate, cannot endorse, cannot sanction. And I have a feeling we may see some consequential constitutional decisions and opinions handed down from even this Supreme Court in the coming months, perhaps the next couple of years, if Donald Trump chooses to continue to ratchet up the illegality. But that's me engaging in a thought experiment, admittedly, because none of this has yet come into full focus as a case before the Supreme Court. To finish the last answer to your question, if attorneys, DOJ attorneys, continue to go into court and argue things that are unconstitutional now in the wake of this new decision by Judge Rodriguez, they could easily be referred to Bar Council. They could be investigated, sanctioned, up to and including being disbarred. And guess what? A presidential pardon power has absolutely no impact on the disbarment of a lawyer in violation of their state rules of ethics, because that's who would conduct a bar investigation and sanction an attorney. Those are state bar councils, and those are state bar licenses that they hold. No presidential pardon can help those attorneys.
And after all, why wouldn't all of these attorneys want to follow in the footsteps of giants like Rudy Giuliani, who is right now sitting in some apartment somewhere because everything else he owned was surrendered in a defamation case because he decided to hitch his wagon to Trump's in the aftermath of the 2020 election.
And disbarred in both jurisdictions in which he was licensed to practice law, New York and D.C.
Right. I have to ask, building on your thought experiment a little bit, this idea that the Supreme Court may have more of a tendency to weigh in. There is also the fact that Donald Trump is right now in defiance of a 9-0 unanimous Supreme Court ruling demanding the release of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And so, we've spoken about this idea of atmospheric precedent, of persuasive authority. And so given the fact that we've already seen Trump defy the Supreme Court once, knowing that he has the capacity to do so, and knowing that the Supreme Court, at least in theory, maybe not Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, but in theory, the institution more broadly has a propensity to want to jealously guard its power and its position as a co-equal branch of government. So do you think that that's going to have some impact on their subsequent rulings, knowing that they've already seen Trump defy them once and knowing that this is where they have an obligation to assert their authority?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think the Supreme Court justices are paying close attention to everything Donald Trump is doing that represents defying court orders. Now, interestingly, in the Abrego Garcia case, which is still in active litigation on the contempt front and on the enforcement of Judge Sini's order to facilitate the release and return of Abrego Garcia, what we saw in recent days is Donald Trump in the court of public opinion say, oh, I can bring Abrego Garcia back, but I won't because he's a gang member. Well, there is no exception to the judges or the Supreme Court's directive to facilitate his release and return that, if he's a gang member, you don't have to. I didn't see that in the Supreme Court opinion. But here's the thing. Whereas Donald Trump has now defied that court order in the court of public opinion by saying that, that is not yet part of the litigation of the Abrego Garcia case, which is still actively moving through the system. So it's one thing to say he is now openly defying Supreme Court orders. He is, but thus far only in the court of public opinion because the release and return of Abrego Garcia is still being actively litigated. There will come a time very soon when those two things will come together, and then it will be put up or shut up time for the Supreme Court. What are they going to do to force, to compel Donald Trump and his administration to comply with Supreme Court orders?
Well, perfectly put. And we are barreling toward that exact scenario in the coming days or weeks here. So we will, of course, stay on top of this issue. For folks who are watching right now, if you want to follow along and stay up to date on all of the legal issues as they continue to break, please make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. The links are right here on the screen. That is the best way to support our work and independent media more broadly. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.